Hello and welcome back to the What's Left podcast with me, Jamie White.
And me, Rob Smith.
Okay. Right, so Rob, interesting news. Most recent developments in Palestine. Well, the long-standing Palestine-Israeli conflict that has resulted in the death of, unfortunately, 254 Palestinians, including 66 children, which is, well, it's just numbers you couldn't think of, isn't it, really?
Yeah, everyone a tragedy. And, of course, I haven't got the figures, but far fewer Israelis.
In fact, it was, I believe, 13 people in Israel were killed, only one being a child. But it seems like the Gaza sort of health ministry have reported that at least 1,900 Palestinians were injured. And obviously, this is quite a long-standing conflict, isn't it? Something that is not so easy to sort of wrap up in maybe a quick 5 minutes. So it's something we're going to be going over today, and how it sort of led to this point, because this has been going on for, well, years, hasn't it? Absolutely years. And the bloodshed's never really stopped since it happened, has it?
No, I mean, it's a history with a long, there's a long history to this conflict. As you say, it goes back at least, 73 years to the creation of Israel, but then further than that as well. And the problem with mainstream reporting on Israel and Palestine is they very rarely delve into the context of the back, the history of what's gone on. I think it probably leaves a lot of viewers very confused about exactly what is going on, and particularly because the way they report it as well. They tend to give very much a sort of both sides narrative. This side did this and this side did that, and I think that's one thing that definitely alternative media has addressed in recent years. But
the bias almost.
Well, it's whether it's bias or whether it's just, when it comes to the BBC, it's a case of wanting to sort of try to remain impartial. But and that's obviously, when you look at the situation, when you've got a very lopsided conflict of this type, that's where it falls down. It's similar to when they used to bring on a climate denier whenever they'd have a discussion on climate change. The vast majority of the world's scientists were saying one thing, that climate change is real and it is caused by human activity, and then on the other side you've got a few cranks, but then they'd present it, so you've got the person representing the vast bulk of the scientific community on this side, and the crank on that side, apparently given equal weighting. And I mean, maybe that's is maybe not quite a direct comparison to what happens when you get reporting on Israel and Palestine, but to an extent, that's the way that the BBC operates its news coverage. And I think, as I say, that's the problem. It will leave viewers sort of slightly mystified as to what's behind all this. They see a conflict that's arisen. There's been an outbreak of hostilities and so on. But at the end of the report, the viewers, if they don't know the background, they're sort of left none the wiser.
And I think this is the big thing, isn't it? Why maybe the media has looked so sort of, it's hard to say impartial, because I think a lot of media, you found mainstream media's really been sort of, I feel personally, more sort of on the side of Israel. It seems to be sort of brushing over the issue, isn't it, really? Not going into sort of the massive conflict, but being like, well, actually, people have died on both sides. And it's like, well, it's a much bigger story than that. So, I mean, the thing that's important to remember is that it's not a clash 100% between two religious ideologies. It is literally a fight between two groups of people that are laying claim to the same land, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the reason why it's not a religious ideology sort of war is basically because this land was previously occupied, well, still is occupied by you got people of the Islamic faith, Judaism, Christianity, and they've all been there since, even Ottoman rule, wasn't it? And I think the conflict itself is one of these things, isn't it? There's not many places left in the world where land isn't almost sort of settled on, if that makes sense. Most countries know what land's theirs now. There's not really any massive disputes over land anymore, apart from sort of things we've seen like the Falklands and maybe places like that. But ultimately, most countries are pretty much set in stone. Like, this is our land. And then you've got this sort of ongoing thing that it's had sort of influence from both sides, hasn't it? I think the West has been
Mm.
heavily influential in the partitioning of the land. And ultimately, sort of, I feel like when you look at sort of like the declarations that made, like the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the thing you find is that with that declaration, it almost sort of tried to remain impartial, but ultimately was serving a bigger purpose than just the people who were there at the time. So, you know, like, it's a complex one, isn't it? Because
Mm.
you've got this agreement that's meant to remain impartial, then ultimately then leads to sort of becoming very one-sided, doesn't it, in the end?
Mm.
So I mean, it
It's
was
interesting
sort of,
when
it was.
you
Sorry.
look at the Balfour Declaration, the way it came about. I mean, it came about during the war, during the First World War, and at the time, the Foreign Secretary was obviously preoccupied with matters of war, particularly creating alliances that are going to help the Allies win the war. So when the Balfour Declaration was drawn up, it was probably drawn up in the way that many pieces of paper were sort of drafted and signed at that time, which was to serve a short-term political end, or strategic end, let's say, rather than political end, in terms of cementing certain alliances to help them with the war, to win the war. You know, so I'm not sure that from the point of view of the British Foreign Secretary, he was thinking that this was something that was still going to be shaping history 100 years later. In fact, I'm almost certain he wasn't thinking that.
No, that was it. It was sign on dotted line and leave it there, wasn't it, really? And I mean, the agreement in short was just to create an establishment in Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people. But am I saying this correctly? Zionists, is it? Zionists?
Zionists, yeah.
Zionists, yeah. I want to pronounce it right. Zionists, though, like, their expectation was quite different, wasn't it? It was more so that they wanted this to be the Jewish national home, didn't they? And at the time of the Balfour Declaration, it wasn't necessarily the case that this was going to happen, was it? It wasn't until the Second World War came along and the persecution of Jews reached sort of like an all-time high, when you had the Nazi occupation, the Holocaust, the camps, and things like, all of which are absolutely disgusting occurrences in history. But this is what really pushed the West, wasn't it, ultimately, to decide that this needs to go further than what it was initially, didn't it? Because obviously you had the League of Nations approve the agreement. I believe it was, from what I can see, it was July the 24th, 1922. And the policy was altered in 1939, which was basically, I suppose, it was to limit the land being completely overrun by Jewish influence. And what you found was there was a white paper in May of 1939 where the British issued this white paper, which recommended a limit of 75,000 immigrants. And the idea was that by 1944, immigration would completely end to Palestine. But obviously, Zionists obviously condemned the policy because they felt it was in favour of the Arabs who lived there at the time. So, you know, it's a very sketchy agreement. It's a very sketchy past of it, and it's much like you say, people probably didn't expect this to go on for so many years. But it is this complex issue of, you've got two people laying claim to the same place. And the issue with that is that there was also, there's not just, you've got the views of the Palestinians, who at the time were sort of just Arabs, weren't they? There wasn't really that sort of title on them initially, that label. But you have these two groups that have their own views to this land. But then you've also got influence from other countries who have their own use for that land.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it got messy, really, wasn't it? You know, the Britain as well, sorry. Other than sort of helping rally up the Jewish opinion of Allied powers, it was also this sort of thing where it helped Britain secure its approaches to the Suez Canal, didn't it? Because they had a lot of British colonial sort of possessions in India. So there was a massive influence from all sides. But I mean, I don't even want to touch more on sort of what happened sort of leading on from World War One, when this Balfour Declaration sort of grew into something much bigger, didn't it?
Well, I don't claim to be an expert on the history of how Israel came into being, but it was a matter of you know, the Zionists obviously seizing on this. You know, the Balfour Declaration could just as easily have been forgotten and never come to anything. But it was a matter of them seizing on this and then building on it to get where they wanted to be, which, you know, obviously, I mean, what happened in intervening years, you know, I don't know exactly how things panned out, but obviously we all know about the Holocaust. And that obviously became something that gave their cause a lot more momentum, because you know there was the greatest illustration of you know the fears really of the Jewish people, because they were as they say, you know, the phrase was you know, a people without a land for a land. So, excuse me, let me get this right. A land without a people for a people without a land, obviously referring to the Jewish people. Yeah, so obviously that was a great illustration of you know, the horrors, you know, which they'd been fears of, you know, this kind of thing, you know, because of the, you know, the persecution of Jewish people, you know, for centuries before that, leading up to that. So, you know, gave them great momentum to just get it over the line, and establish the state of Israel. But yeah, it's interesting because of obviously you mentioned there about the Palestinians being Arabs. So of course, that's how the Jews, well, the Israelis, let's say, define the people of Palestine. They define them as being Arabs, and in fact, it's a justification.
I suppose is that to take their that's to take their identity away, is it? So they're they're not Palestinians because this is Israeli
that's
land.
Right. Well, yeah, they deny the idea that Palestine ever existed, or there is such a thing as Palestine, or there are such a thing as Palestinians. Now, and it is obviously calculated as part of their, you know, their rhetoric,
Propaganda,
propaganda, you know, in order to sort of deny them, you know, any ground in the argument. But the thing about the Palestinians is that essentially they're the same people as the you know, when they share the same ancestry as the Jewish people. You know, these people have lived in these lands. You know, some of them, yeah. I mean, many Palestinians were somewhat nomadic, and you know, and probably have roots in different countries in the region. But you know, essentially, many of the Palestinian people are effectively, you know, closely related to the Jewish people. So it's very much a strategy of the you know, the Israelis to try to deny this heritage to the Palestinians, and say, you know, well, if you look at all the lands, you know, all the countries, you know, there are Arabs, you know, we're surrounded by Arabic countries. You know, all we want is this one little country here. Why can't they go there? That's effectively the purpose to sort of calling them Arabs, is to say, well, you're Arabs, go to Arab lands. You know, go to Jordan, go to Syria, you know, go to Egypt. You know,
yeah, because this is exactly what's happened, isn't it? People who are fleeing to those areas. So it's almost sort of like this Israeli takeover, where you get to this point where, yeah, they're sort of almost sending them back, isn't it? It was sort of like the Brexit rhetoric, wasn't it? It was, you know, you had people saying, oh, well, go back to your own country, sort of thing. And it's sort of the similar thing here, isn't it? It's like, well, actually, well, this is Jewish land. Why don't you go back to your Arabic nations? Do you know what I mean? So it's weird, because obviously the Jews were massively persecuted, and you're getting to this point now where it's almost the Jews now doing the persecution, isn't it? The Jewish people doing the persecution. But obviously the flip side of that being that, unfortunately, because anti-Semitism was such a disgusting mark in history, especially in modern day history, when you look at the Holocaust, for example, which is obviously a whole other subject in itself. But
Mm.
the issue with it is that you've got countries now that I think almost sort of maybe fear talking up too much against the Israeli government in the fear that they're going to be called anti-Semitic for certain actions which were actually taken against the Jewish people in the first place. So it's almost like
Mm.
the Jewish people taking these actions, this violence and this oppression, and pushing it onto the Palestinian people, and then it's sort of an unquestionable act when literally this is where we got into the situation in the first place.
Mm.
Um, and I think it's weird because obviously what ended up happening was there was this solidification, wasn't it, of this idea that the Jews need a country. I sound a bit the Jews, but like the Jewish people needed a country where it would sort of give them an identity, wasn't it? It was somewhere so that they couldn't be persecuted. It was somewhere to call their own. But obviously, at the time of when they occupied Palestine, the land that is now Israel, it was
Mm.
only, I think, 15% of land was only meant to be initially given anyway, wasn't it, to Israel? Um, and it obviously grew into this land grab that it has today because it was so after the war when this idea got solidified. You had in 1947 the UN basically decided to divide the area into two states.
Mm.
So you had Israel, which is going to be the Jewish majority area. You had the Muslim majority area of Palestine, but Jerusalem was meant to remain a neutral religious zone because it's sacred to all faiths that were there. So like the
Yeah.
Muslims, Jews, Christians. But obviously that very much changed it because the Palestinian opinion at the time was that this was almost an attempt by the West to colonize, wasn't it?
Mm.
And to eliminate that identity of the Palestinian people that live there. So that sort of led on to the Arab League and the Arab Liberation Army, didn't it? Which rose up
Mm.
with the support of these surrounding Arab states, which ultimately led to an Arab-Israeli war in, not like about a year later on, wasn't it? Really,
Mm.
unfortunately, Israel, due to their backing in the war, won that, didn't they? They won
Mm.
that war, and they took over part of Jerusalem. So that agreement was being more or less broken
Mm.
immediately, wasn't it? So it was immediately in defiance of everything.
Yeah.
They took more Palestinian lands as quote unquote spoils of war. And the issue with that is it's almost like we have this now, and it's that exploitation of what it is, isn't it? So this is
Mm.
ours, but we have more, and it sort of goes against the whole sort of the good nature of maybe what this whole agreement was in the first place. We're trying to
Yeah.
give you an identity, and now what Israel is trying to do is take away that identity from the Palestinians.
Mm.
Um, and surely the whole idea of obviously all the atrocities that occurred to the Jewish people, because this is obviously the Holocaust was not the first time the Jews were persecuted. This has gone on for well centuries, isn't it?
Mm.
But you'd almost think that their ultimate end goal to all of this would be that they'd want harmony and
Yeah.
peace. But it seems like that was very, very different, wasn't it? Because you basically ended up with Palestinians being reduced to the Gaza Strip and West Bank, and that was pretty much it, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I
uh,
think when you look at what's happened, I mean, as you say about the 1967 war, I mean, following on from that, many Palestinians, ultimately became persuaded that the borders as drawn up post 67 would be an acceptable way to sort of move forward to a solution which would lead to two states basically living side by side. The problem is that the Israelis, for their part, don't ever seem to have acted in good faith because they undertook, of course, then many years later, to agree to implement a two-state solution on those borders, and then, as you say, once again, similar to the annexation of Jerusalem, they continued to fund and provide the means for settlers to continually move in, into Palestinian occupied areas, level their houses, and build new settlements, in contravention of agreements. I mean, particularly going back to, going to the Oslo Accords,
Hmm.
the ink was barely
That
dried,
was that was
and
much
already,
further down the line, wasn't it?
yeah, we haven't really got to that. But I mean,
No, of course, yeah, go for it. No,
it's just the bad faith, isn't it? Really, of sort of immediately, before the ink has dried, you're already starting to unravel that agreement. Really, it was just signed in bad faith in the first place. Yeah.
well, and this is it, isn't it? Because this is the point it's at, where it's sort of like you say, that agreeing to those borders, saying that this is two states living side by side. This is what has occurred, isn't it? Is that you've got to this point now where, like you said, this lack of good faith has led to just constant bloodshed. You've got Israel claiming this land is theirs. You've got Palestine being angry that this land has now been taken off them, and it's just bizarre because obviously the backing that Israel have had through their whole development as a country has resulted in so many conflicts, so many further conflicts. It's unreal. I mean, I don't know if you remember. Have you heard about the 6 Day War?
Yeah, I don't know the history of that particularly, but I'm happy to be enlightened.
So I know I know sort of some stuff to do with the 6 Day War. So basically, it was Egypt. To put it in brief, without going into all the nitty gritty of it, Egypt basically said Israeli goods were coming through. Egypt said no, thank you, take them back. We're not interested. And Israel was like, okay, and just launched an airstrike. So it was pretty much like, oh, you won't let our boat come through. No, okay. Airstrike came in, destroyed Egyptian it was an aerial attack unit in Egypt, and basically the communication between Egypt and Jordan at the time was so poor that it resulted in basically Israel once again winning the war. So in 6 days, they'd managed to take over basically the entirety of Jerusalem, further occupation of Palestinian lands, and they even took over and occupied some parts of Egypt and Jordan. So the problem with that is when you sort of look into it, it's this sort of land grab behavior, isn't it? It's like land grab, land grab, land grab.
Yeah.
And you get to this point where it's this ferocious sort of behavior, isn't it? Where it's just getting their teeth into everything. And this is the issue that's come, is that, you can feel sorry for the persecution that they face, and absolutely no one of any faith, any religion, I mean, take that all away. I mean, just no human being should have to go through any of the atrocities that they faced. But ultimately, the thing is that when that persecution then becomes inflicted on other people who have been through that level of persecution, it gets to a point where it's very hard to feel sorry for them, and it's almost just the question of, what the fuck are you actually doing? There's no other better way of putting it, is there really? And it's, you then had, following on from that, you had the Camp David Accords, which were basically done under Jimmy Carter when he was president. And it was a peace treaty basically between Israel and Egypt, and as a gesture of goodwill. So this land belonged to Egypt, but as a gesture of goodwill, Israel said, all right, you can have it back. Which is just it's ridiculous, isn't it? It's like almost like me squatting in your house, and you come home and you're like, well, hang on a minute, this is my house, and I'm like, no, it's definitely mine. And you go to the police, and then the police say, well, do you know what, in good faith you can have the house back. And yeah, he's just gone back to someone else's house. Do you know what I mean? And it's ridiculous, isn't it? Because you just think to yourself, how is that a gesture of goodwill? That is, that's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous, isn't it? I don't know too much about. I won't comment too much on this, but I do know that after the Camp David Accords and this sort of mess that happened, it basically led more or less to a lot of nations sort of stepping back and taking less, paying less attention, taking less notice of Israel's actions. They're sort of like, no, we'll stay out of it. You seem to be very good at winning wars, and we'll leave it there. But then, obviously, I think you're familiar with this, Jen, aren't you? As Yasser Arafat, is it?
Yasser Arafat, yeah.
The PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was basically, its agenda was to stop the Israel takeover, wasn't it, and
Yeah,
regaining control of a Muslim majority, wasn't it?
yeah, yeah. Well, I think that was where I first really remember hearing about the Israel-Palestine conflict was when Yasser Arafat was leading the PLO, and obviously this was a time in the 1980s. You then had the Intifada, which was the second Intifada, I think it was at that point, which was the uprising, Palestinian uprising, and obviously it was a time when the Palestinians basically got their act together and came together as one, to really push back against the policies of Israel, and obviously got them ultimately to that point where they were able to sit down at the negotiating table and thrash out what became the Oslo Accords. The problem is that what seemed like a very historic treaty, unfortunately now looks like a sort of hollow victory from the perspective of sort of 30 years down the line, which but the idea was, as I've already mentioned there, was to sort of put the framework into place and the sort of roadmap, as it were, for moving towards what they call the two-state solution, that being a state of Israel, a state of Palestine, side by side, and obviously Palestine having ultimately becoming a full state and actually gaining statehood and all the institutions that go with that. The problem was it never really clearly it has not happened. There were some superficial moves in terms of creating the Palestinian Authority, but they really have Palestinian Authority. I mean, they don't really have a lot of authority. Obviously, they tend to basically their main role seems to be to support Israel's security efforts in the region, so-called security efforts in the region, basically keeping the boot firmly on the throat of the Palestinian people, and obviously the lands themselves remained under the occupation of Israel. So very very little actually changed. Although in theory, it should have been the start of a peace process which resulted in the creation of the two obviously there was a state of Israel, but the creation of a Palestinian state, and it's never happened, and the fact is now, and really it will take the major players to acknowledge this for us to get the next step forward. But the reality is, the de facto situation is that the two-state solution is dead. It's never going to happen now. And really the only solution, realistic solution now, other than the Palestinian people being evicted fully from those lands and forced out or killed, whichever one, so that Israel does eventually occupy the entire region, control, not just control, but actually bring the entire region fully into the borders of Israel. That's one apocalyptic scenario for the Palestinians. The other one is a single state solution, which would mean a sort of combined state of Israel and Palestine. Those are the only two options on the table now, and neither of them are palatable to the Israelis. But it's the problem is this situation is of their own making. They were supposedly happy enough to sign up to the agreement in Oslo on the basis of a two-state solution, and they've done everything in their power to make sure it doesn't happen. So it's down to them that no longer is an option.
Yeah, and this is the thing now, isn't it? Is that I think it is so deep in, and there is so little involvement from, like you say, the bigger players. The UK, who sort of almost were the sort of catalyst of all this anyway in the first place, weren't they? These bigger nations saying, "Oh well, actually, we're the saviors of the day. And it's kind of got to this point where actually the saviors of the day have just caused massive problems and then sort of gone, right, that's not happening. Palestine-Israel conflict, don't know what you're talking about. But the issue is that sort of ignorance and that ignoring of what is going on is just leading to more conflict, more bloodshed. I mean, the fact that we can tie anything, can't we? We can tie any world crisis, Rob, to the Labour Party, can't we? Somehow we can always come back to the Labour Party. And there was an interesting point you
to
made,
the left
actually, wasn't
anyway.
there, about,
yeah,
to the left of
in
Labour
general,
Party.
yes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Labour have had their fair share of troubles in this department. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and I think, is there sort of any examples you can give? Because obviously this was when Jeremy Corbyn was in. Chances that we mentioned Jeremy Corbyn on here as well is absolutely shocking, isn't it? I mean, words have never left our mouths. And it's at this point, isn't it, where with Jeremy Corbyn, there's that anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was pretty much to do with certain members of Parliament trying to speak up against this issue, wasn't it? Which led to some unnerving sackings, really, didn't it? I mean, if you want to go touch a bit more on that.
Well, in terms of, that's right. The one I think particularly referring to is Chris Williamson, who was never a member of the, was he in the shadow cabinet? I can't remember, but he's a close ally of Jeremy Corbyn. Chris Williamson, obviously, like many on the left, particularly in the Socialist Campaign Group in Labour, is a strong supporter of the the Palestinian cause, and had spoken up. I mean, there'd already been, right from the moment pretty much that Jeremy Corbyn won the leadership election. Several things happened. When the leadership election kicked off, they made the rule that in order to bring people into the party, they made the rule that you could become a registered Labour Party member for a very low thing. It was like £3 or something like that. So immediately, it brought many people into the party, and many of these were people who disaffected former members of the Labour Party, but particularly these were people quite often on the left, and because Labour had become a party of the centre since not even Blair, I mean since Neil Kinnock really, many of these people over the years had just sort of felt Labour had left them really, and sort of came back to the party because really to support Jeremy Corbyn and his bid to be leader, and obviously took a lot of people by surprise when he did win the leadership contest. Now a lot of these new or returning members, as I say, very much to the left of where the Labour Party had been in preceding years. And the Palestinian cause is one of the big causes of the left, and it has been. It has been for decades, and so it was inevitable. Really, you're going to find that the pushback against this. I mean, there are probably several ways it could have gone, but the tactic there, and it's Israel's tactic that they've used in terms of trying to discredit people who have attacked them and criticised them is to call them out as anti-Semites, and so this is what immediately started to happen. You had people accusing members of the Labour Party. And we're not talking about, by the way, here members of the Parliamentary Party. I will come to that, but these are just ordinary members of the Labour Party. Accused of saying and doing things that are anti-Semitic. And as I say, it's not to say that there were no genuine cases of anti-Semitism. I mean, the party had swelled in any case to being, I don't know by what percentage, but it had gone from a few 100,000 to over half a million members in the membership, under Jeremy Corbyn. So, a huge, the party become, a huge party once again. You're bound to have, in any large organisation, there's going to be a few, bad apples, few rogue elements. So it's not to say that there weren't, genuine examples and cases of people who were anti-Semitic, who had said and done things that were, but a large part of that, my understanding anyway, from what I've read about this, accounts that I've read, was definitely the weaponized version of the pushback, weaponized anti-Semitism, basically calling people out as anti-Semites because they were critical of Israel, and I think when we're coming back to talk about Chris Williamson, as I say, a prominent MP who was a big supporter of Palestine, fell victim simply because he was standing up for Labour members who had been ejected from the party, who, in his view, and I think on the facts as well, these were not clear-cut cases of anti-Semitism. Again, it was people who were socialists, who were very much supporters of Palestine. But being a supporter of Palestine is not, in and of itself, anti-Semitic. I mean, there's a lot of allegations. A lot of old tweets were dug up and all the rest of it. But I think, looking back on it now, it's very clear. The pattern is very clear. These were often, as we talk about bad faith when we're talking about Israel's policies, but again, these were, very active and strong supporters of Israel. I mean, there was an account called Nasher Jew on Twitter, which their sole purpose was to forensically investigate all social media posts and utterances and tweets and so on from members of the Labour Party who on the left of the party, and try to find anything that they could spin effectively as being what they could identify as being anti-Semitic. But as I say, much of this was about criticism of Israel. So purely through defending some of these people, Chris Williamson ended up being booted out, suspended initially, booted out. Eventually he quit. I think. I don't think he was actually.
Am I correct that initially he sort of got through his first proceedings, wasn't it? I think he sort of defended himself.
Well, an accusation was made, and he went to court, and yes, he effectively, I think, in the first, the problem is I should have looked this up and made just checked what exactly happened, but no.
Bloody hell, Rob. Where's your notes?
This is what happened in a nutshell. Is it that he successfully defended himself against the initial accusation, and because that sort of left the door open for him effectively to be brought back into the party, they then came up with another reason. I don't remember what that was. Effectively, another trumped-up charge, because it would be too embarrassing to say no. Actually, what he said was reasonable. It wasn't anti-Semitic, and so they and it was clear that it was just going to go on. So I think he eventually quit, seeing he saw the way the wind was blowing, basically. So that's and obviously the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, many people, if you followed politics on social media, be well aware, really, of the ongoing attacks. But he's not been leader for over a year now. It's crazy, really. But but certainly when he was leader, the anti-Semitism thing dogged him. And you had to feel what could he do in the end. I mean, I think recently, it was only last week, I think Lisa Nandy, who's in the current shadow cabinet, was sort of put on the spot. I don't even remember how it came out, but she I think, was she on Question Time, something like that. But she said, what Jeremy Corbyn needs to do is before he's we go any further in terms of, I think they were talking about letting him back into the party, restoring the whip. He needs to apologise to all Jews. Well, the crazy thing about it is, I mean, how many times does Jeremy Corbyn have to apologise? I mean, I can think of numerous occasions when he's been apologetic. I mean, the various reports that came out, he's apologised so many times. I mean, but they just want to keep on saying it's never enough. He's got to keep apologising forever, it seems.
And it's bizarre, isn't it? Because there's two types of apologies, isn't it? And I mean, you find that when it comes to it's a weird one, isn't it? Because anti-Semitism was a sort of like the claws of a vulture in the Labour Party's back, wasn't it? But then you come to the point where you've got Boris Johnson, our new Prime Minister, who literally has not only been racist on multiple occasions, but openly racist, where, he made comments like people in hijabs look like letterboxes, isn't it, or post boxes. But the Tory party aren't being investigated for Islamophobia.
Well, the report came out last week, and it was a whitewash, wasn't it? So
yeah, and this is it, and it's very hush hush, isn't it? Very hush hush. When anti-Semitism was rife in Labour Party, it was taken up front page newspapers, everything like that. And then you've got sort of like it goes to show how little it's been spoken about, that I haven't even heard about a report into Islamophobia. You've obviously heard about this report, and as you say, it's been a whitewash. And it's one of these things. It's very typical, isn't it? It's very hypocritical to push that one religion cannot be misspoken about, or even not necessarily, I'd say, in the circumstances of the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, that it's not necessarily a bad mouthing, is it? It's not bad mouthing the religion. It's about an issue. It's a situation. But directly just saying derogatory comments to parts of a practicing faith, directly about a faith, and that almost is like, well, that's not newsworthy, is it? I mean, some of the things that have been said recently by members of the Conservatives and the Tory party it's abysmal, isn't it? And it's not even being spoken about. You got a Prime Minister who basically is, without a doubt, without any questions, racist, but it's almost being sort of painted in different colour, isn't it? It's like, oh no, well, that's not actually what's happening. That's not what's happening. Oh, don't forget, he's got that Muslim bloke on the front bench, and it's like, yeah, but that doesn't make him not racist, does it? He's got Priti Patel. Her family came from blah 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 background, and it's like, well, that doesn't mean anything, Boris, does it? It's bizarre. It's like that whole argument, isn't it, of when people say, oh, well, I've got a black friend, actually, I can make that comment. and it's just such a pathetic way of dealing with it. And it's one of these things that, and I think if we think that the Tory party are going to get involved at any point in the Palestinian issue, or get involved with it without siding with Israel, I mean, it's not going to happen, is it? Let's be honest, it's not going to happen. You've had the good old people of Britain, who may be partially to blame, well, a lot to blame, in the first place, coming out on the streets. And there's been protests, a lot of protests, big protests in London, wasn't there, about free Palestine? But unfortunately, I think that Palestine is probably the bottom of a lot of countries' lists for issues, isn't it, really? I mean, I don't think anyone wants to get involved, and it's for multiple different reasons, isn't it? And one of them being the anti-Semitic label. It's hard to sort of say anything about Israel without it being twisted into something that is not a comment about an anti-Semitic comment. So, even maybe this whole podcast that we're doing here, this whole episode, could be anti-Semitic. Maybe we're siding with the Palestinians because we have something against the Jews. This is the risk whenever you talk about Israel. Really, you're going to get accused of it, probably. Well, I mean, luckily we're not members of the Labour Party, so it's not as if we're going to get investigated and booted out of anything, is it, really? So no.
But no, this is the problem, and this is the reason why it has been weaponized, because it's very effective. It's very effective at shutting down criticism of legitimate criticisms of Israel, especially in I mean, I'm sure it's probably being used, I don't know, but it's probably been used for many years. But especially when you think about how identity politics it has become such a big part of political discourse over the last, I don't know, I guess would you say 10, 15 years, and that's playing to the way that identity politics has become important. Things like Black Lives Matter and so on. Any accusations of racism now tend to stick. They tend to become excuse me, I've just got to move the cat. Sorry about that. You'll have to edit that bit, Jamie.
I'm absolutely not.
And now I've lost my thread. No, I think what was I trying to say? That yeah, I think that's why the accusations of anti-Semitism tend to really stick and tend to be so effective now, because we've seen a different the way that politics has, as I say, moved in towards identity, naturally towards identity politics. I mean, particularly, I suppose it was before. It was really moving this way, obviously, a lot before the 2008 financial crisis, because at that time, rightly, well, wrongly, let's say, but right or wrongly, the prevailing notion in mainstream politics was that there was no longer a discussion to be had around economic policy, for example, or social policy. Neoliberalism had become accepted by the parties, of course, on the right and on the left, like New Labour, as being a fight that there was no point in having, because neoliberalism was here to stay. Those ideological battles are in the past, and so things have naturally moved on to social issues, but certainly towards identity politics as being the main political battleground, certainly for the left, and in those sort of issues. So I suppose that's that's how we came to be in that place, and I think obviously since then, as I say, this is a calculated strategy by supporters of Israel to move the debate onto that territory, into that arena.
Where it's less about the actual.
Use it as a stick to beat any critics with, rather than discussing what is actually happening on the ground and the oppression of the Palestinian people. No. Any criticism of Israel there, is anti-Semitic.
Yeah, it's a good ball gag, isn't it? It's a good ball gag for politicians and the public alike, isn't it? Really, it's stay out of our business, because everything you're saying is to do with us being Jewish, not the fact that we're killing children, not the fact that we're killing adults, not the fact we're taking land off people and we're kicking people out of their homes. It's nothing to do with that at all. It's because we're Jewish.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned, Jamie. It's interesting you mentioned the idea of killing children there, because one of the things that I've seen come up, in recent years, and when we're talking about using anti-Semitism, weaponized anti-Semitism, just the idea of mentioning children dying. And the thing is about, because I think we haven't really discussed what's happened recently. We've gone through the history. I guess we'll come on in a minute to sort of talk about the recent events and how that's come about and so on. But of course, when this recent bombing of Gaza took place, how many did you say? 61 children, was it, or more? Was it?
Let me have a quick check.
Well, I think it was about 60 odd children. It was a lot of kids.
66 children. So 254 Palestinians in total died, and of that 254, 66 were children.
66 children, yeah, because they were basically indiscriminately bombing, areas in Gaza, which they knew full well were civilian areas, and one of the interesting, the demographic statistics, I think, is that the population of Gaza is something like, it's nearly 50% children under 16. So if you're going to just rain bombs down on Gaza, you are going to be killing a lot of children, because there's a hell of a lot of children there, you know. But the what I was going to come round to on that was that people who have pointed out the fact that children are being killed, particularly if they use emotive language, such as the Israelis have the blood of children on their hands, they've been attacked simply for saying that. They've been attacked using this stick of anti-Semitism, and the reason for that is because of something that's known as the blood libel, and this goes back to, I think, even, you know, to medieval times. I'm not sure quite what the origin of it was, but it was the idea that you know, one of these anti-Semitic tropes that Jews kind of killed children and drank their blood. It's something horrific, horrible.
I think I've heard of that.
This is what they call the blood libel.
Yeah.
Now they've invoked. I mean, it's disgusting to even think that they're actually using this anti-Semitic trope as a way to stifle criticism of the fact that people are pointing out that Israel has indiscriminately killed civilians, and in doing so, knowing very well that it will be killing children. They've used this medieval anti-Semitic trope to try and shut down that criticism, which I find extraordinary.
No, it's abysmal, isn't it? It's just, how the hell do you get away with it? And it's definitely, this is what it is now, isn't it? It's digging up whatever from the past, and like you say, it's become about an argument of identity, not an argument against what is actually occurring. And I mean, what has been occurring recently, I don't know whether you want to touch on that. I think it's still quite a developing issue, and it's still something that needs to be sort of well, I doubt there's going to be a resolution. I think I saw recently in the news that they're going to oust the Israeli Prime Minister. This was today in the news. But once again, I won't comment on that too much, because I don't know whether, one, that will affect anything.
Yeah, I think the situation there, I think, as far as I know, is not directly related to the recent outbreak of hostility, because I mean, Netanyahu in any case has struggled to win re-election. I think the last in the last round of elections, his party failed to secure a majority, so he's been sort of trying to cling on to power for a while now. So I don't think that the situation with Netanyahu has particularly got anything to do with.
So that's once again, mainstream media latching on to the idea that this is something to do with that conflict and it's going to resolve something.
I may be wrong. Well, it might resolve it not having Netanyahu there, but the problem is, I think that in mainstream politics in Israel, I mean, there's not much distinction between right and left. So he's most definitely a figure of the right. But if you look at politicians who are ostensibly of the left, they don't really, there's not much difference between them in terms of their outlook and their policy towards the Palestinians. So I think a change of leadership isn't really going to result in a change of policy. Let's say it's definitely not going to result in a change of policy. That much is clear. So there's no hope to be had from the possibility that Netanyahu has reached the end of the line. I don't think that's going to, you know, in and of itself make any difference whatsoever.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, with recent developments, as I said, it is a constantly moving issue. I think really that what this episode was about was just kind of maybe raising awareness, going a little bit into the history without going too far into the nitty gritty, and just, you know, helping, I think, maybe people understand a bit more, you know, what's going on. But I mean, in brief, really, it's just human beings being disgusting towards other human beings. It's the people trying to move people out of what is their land and what could be a shared land, but unfortunately neither party really want it to be a shared land, do they? And I think that, you know, the persecution of Israel to the Palestinians isn't going to stop, and I don't think it's going to stop really until Israel is Israel and it's not any influence of Palestine. There's not a patch of Palestine left. I mean, that's most definitely. I mean, I think you know, I saw a video clip which was recorded shortly after. I think it was after the initial Hamas rocket attacks
this was about 2 weeks ago. I think that's when it all kicked off, wasn't it? And they were just interviewing, and this, the thing that struck me about this as well is one of these sort of things where they go onto the street with Vox Pop. I don't know where it was. It was in Tel Aviv, I think, or possibly it was in Jerusalem. But they were basically just saying, look, what do you think of the people of Gaza? What do you think of the Palestinians and so on? And what do you think the solution is? And as I say, the range of people they'd interviewed here. I mean, they may have interviewed many people for this. Of course, it was a Vox Pop and it's edited together, and so you don't know what range of responses they got. But regardless of the range of responses, there was at least I think it was 5 or 6 young people who they'd spoken to on the street, and I mean the attitudes were putting it mildly depressing. I mean. They were saying things like, "Well, they're like vermin. They should be wiped off the face of the earth. We should just, we should bomb them until every single one of them is dead." These were the sort of attitudes that they had. From the Israeli point of view, and that's the thing. It's hard to sort of see how that's going to change. I mean, bearing in mind, Israel, by law. All Israelis have to undertake national service, which, in the IDF, I mean, it's going to lead to inevitably it's going to lead to a certain sort of measure of brainwashing.
Stigma.
They're going to take on certain attitudes. I mean, if and this is going to pervade the whole of Israeli society, because. If you're going to go into the army, well, one thing you're probably, while you're in the army, you're going to probably see atrocious acts. You're quite possibly going to commit atrocious acts, and this is probably why these attitudes are so ingrained there. So yeah,
it's almost like this desensitization, isn't it, to violence as well, which is typical with any sort of armed forces, isn't it? This idea that violence is necessary, and it's the eradication of threat.
Yeah, from a practical point of view, I mean, if you're, if you're trying to create an effective army who are going to take out the enemy, then firstly you don't really want them to think much about the enemy, but ideally you want to completely dehumanize the enemy, so that they don't even think of them as being human beings. So, I mean, just from a practical point of view, that's probably what most induction into the army involves, really, is sort of making people not question the humanity of the person at the other end of the gun. So yeah. That's pretty much I think a really valid point to end it on, really, isn't it? Is that this is what's happened. It's 2 groups of people, and you've got Israel. I mean, as I said, let's not be biased. It happens in any armed forces, any group. But there's a stigma that's been attached to Palestinians. The stigma that's been attached to Israelis, and it's this dehumanizing of 2 groups, isn't it? Where it's almost at the point where neither side are seeing either as people, are they? They're both each other's quote unquote oppressors, aren't they? I think that's probably is whether you can say there's sort of 2 sides of it, because there probably the attitudes are probably there that on the Palestinian side as well, but I do get the sense that the Palestinians would really quite welcome any form of dialogue and movement towards a settlement, whereas where Israel is right now, unless something changes externally, unless America, for example, who are essentially supporting, and as long as they are supporting Israel financially through military support and so on, nothing on their side is really going to change, and it's really going to take the pressure around the globe. It's going to take that really to shift them from where they are right now. And this obviously is where, particularly, movements in countries like Britain and America, Palestinian solidarity movements can come in, because we can play our part by trying to bring pressure to bear on political leaders. Now, you mentioned the Conservative Party. Obviously, they're not, you know, they're obviously the kind of party who are more inclined to be supporters of Israel than they are of the Palestinian cause. But you know, at the end of the day, it's about building up momentum. I mean, the Conservatives are not always going to be in power. It may seem like that right now, but they're not. And I think the important thing is for people to try to, you know, where you can, give your support. I mean, it could be something as simple as signing a petition online. I mean, we might scoff at things like that, but it's a form of action. It's at the lowest end of any form of action, but it's a form of action. But everything ultimately counts towards the struggle, and it's not to underestimate what we can do in this country. I mean, you can write to your MP, you know, you can write to your local council, for goodness sake. You can, you know, or you could try and start a petition, you know, in a school or a college or something. You could try and start a petition, bring it to your local council, try and get your council to word a statement in solidarity with the Palestinian people, or condemning particular Israeli atrocities and things like that. So there's things that we can do. You know, it might seem like a remote struggle, but there's things that we can do, and I think that's what, you know, we need to hold on to. And obviously in America again, and when we've seen there is some you know, cause for some optimism and hope when you see in Congress, men and women standing up and denouncing Israel. I think people may be familiar with the group of Congress women called the Squad. You know, sort of effectively led by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You know, to see a US Congresswoman tweet the words "apartheid states are not democracies," I mean, that's quite significant. And you know,
it's a sign of hope, isn't it?
She stood up and you know, laid into Israel. I mean, this is not something that's happened in America. It's small scale. I mean, they're by no means anywhere close to a majority, even in her own party. So, but the point is, it's the start of things, and it's how things can start and how things can change. And you know, that's why solidarity, you know, with the people of Palestine is important. All of us, you know, we can bring pressure to bear on our political leaders. You only have to look at the example of South Africa. I mean, there was the issue sort of came to a head because, you know, there were sanctions brought, but it was largely down to the efforts of protest groups in Western nations that kept on highlighting the issue, wouldn't let it go away, and forced the politicians' hand in bringing an end to apartheid. And the same thing can happen. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen within Israel. There's no movement within Israel. There are dissenting Israeli voices, but they're not enough. It's going to take, you know, the weight of people around the world in solidarity with this cause to make a change. And I think that's why it is important to the left, because we recognise, you know, socialism essentially is internationalist by nature, and that's how this change can happen.
Exactly, it's that collective movement, isn't it, from all nations to bring peace to the Palestinians and end the conflict in Israel. Because ultimately the point we're at now is where, obviously, like you say, Israel's not going to turn around and go, oh, hang on, oh no, have your land back, Palestine, have your land back. We've decided it was all for nothing, and here we are. But you know, this is the thing, isn't it? It's that collective movement to finally get the world leaders and the world stage to notice what the conflict that's occurring, and to actually bring peace to that land. And it's not even just like you say, there's voices of dissent in Israel, and it's about those voices sort of being heard in other nations as well, isn't it? So it's to say that, look, what's happening in Israel is wrong, what's happening in Palestine is wrong. It's about that collective movement, so that finally Palestinians can have their peace and Israel can end their conflict, and they can end their land grab, and they can be that equal split which was agreed in the Accords years ago, can't it? So this is what we're working towards. But I think we've touched all bases now, I think, and
Yeah.
I think that's it, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't
Unless there's
really got
anything else you want to
anything.
add.
I haven't got much else to add, to be honest. But actually, we didn't really come on to much of the events of what happened recently. But I think it's probably best just to sort of wrap it there. We've said our piece, and as I say to anybody who's thinking, you know, well, how does this affect me? You know, we are a connected world, aren't we? And I think you know, it doesn't take much time to think beyond your own, our own struggles in this country, to think, you know, well, if I were in this situation, I'd want to feel that other people in the world were on my side, and we're in solidarity with my struggle. And as I say, even something as simple as signing a petition, it's, you know, it can all help. So I'd encourage people really to think, you know, what can we do, and if there is anything, you know, and if you can just donate, you know, donate to you know, one of the solidarity movements or pressure group and things like that, and it's something, you know, it's something we can do.
Absolutely, and I think obviously it is a developing situation, as I mentioned before. So this episode was really about going into sort of the detail, wasn't it? Going into the depth, trying to add a bit of context to what's going on. I think, you know, at the moment, all we've seen is sort of conflict, and, you know, it's pretty obvious what the boiling pot of that conflict, what led to that conflict in the first place. But I think that maybe next episode it'd be best to touch on a bit more about what's developed over that time. At the moment, it's a bit early to say, isn't it, what is going to happen? But maybe we may see some more. I mean, obviously the events really are catastrophic, but we'll see some more changes maybe in the coming weeks. And we'll be in a better position to really comment, because at the moment it's all sort of just flared up, hasn't it? And it's that mix of flare still, isn't it, at the moment?
It's flared up. It's died down for a little bit, but we want to see if there's going to be any long term sort of any